If there ever was any hesitation in understanding that Rubber Soul ended Beatlemania, musically anyway, the album Revolver drove the point home. 1966 was the year that Beatle fans transitioned from basically being young screaming girls to young males following some kind of a musical path. And although the Beatles had several obligations to fulfill in 1966 in that summer, namely concerts, they put on the mop-top image one last time. Once recording was completed in late June of 1966, the Beatles embarked on this last tour, which started in Germany, went through Japan and Manila, and wound up in the States for an 18-day tour in 14 cities. Judging from interactions with reporters at press conferences on this tour, they seemed eager for the charade of doing concert appearances to be over. Rubber Soul, released in December of 1965, raised the bar considerably as what became known now as the rock album, and Revolver was an extension of that and really built on the exotic sounds started on Rubber Soul. Contrary to popular belief, all four Beatles had taken LSD by December 1965. Paul McCartney was the last one to do so, and he did that on December 12th. And this was after their last concert at Cardiff. He was out with John Lennon that night, and Lennon went home, and Paul was left with Tara Brown and Viv Prince, who had recently been sacked by the Pretty Things. He was their drummer. So they went back to Brown's house, and that's where McCartney tried LSD for the first time. After a 3-month break at the beginning of 1966, this was the space where they would have shot a new film had they not decided not to do it. They went right to work. Now, with all four members fully psychedelicized, the recording for their upcoming album took on a very certain tone.
Look at all the lonely people. She said, "You don't understand what I said." When she says her love is dead, you think she needs you.
We'll start off with Eleanor Rigby, which utilizes a string octet as opposed to a string quartet on Yesterday. And Eleanor Rigby feels like a much darker version of that song and a more mature version of that song. She Said is a defining psychedelic song, both lyrically and instrumentally. Love You Too, George Harrison takes the sitar to yet another level higher than what he had done on Norwegian Wood. For No One utilizes the French horn and brings that song into a real classical feel. The die was cast on Rubber Soul when George Harrison became a more respected songwriter, but that took another leap on Revolver, adding 3 songs. Taxman is the Beatles' first political song, snaring with a little bit of a comic edge to it. I Want to Tell You is a good little rock song that inspired the riff in the Monkees' Pleasant Valley Sunday.
Running my hands through it. Tell me that you heard every sound there is, and your back and swing. Good day, sunshine.
The progressive nature of the first 6 songs I played get interrupted by those last 3 songs, which were just pure sunshine. Now, probably over the heads of some of the listeners, some of the songs have slight drug references, like these next 3.
I was alone, I took a ride, I didn't know what I would find there.
You know, the drug vernacular was not really in full use in summer of '66 yet, so some of these songs may not have been seen as drug songs, but there's some references here, like in Dr. Robert, that would be somebody who's seeking to score drugs. I'm Only Sleeping is kind of the feeling after taking drugs, and Got to Get You Into My Life is wanting drugs to be part of your everyday life. So far, there's not a clunker on this album, and Got to Get You Into My Life has got that great brass section, again with a little bit of a Motown feel, but that brass adds a lot of excitement to it, as does the guitar at the end of the song. Now, this would have been a perfect closing track if it wasn't for this next song.
Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream.
One of the 1960s most experimental songs, Tomorrow Never Knows, owes a huge debt to the work of John Cage. Now, the other things that was brought into this song, this incorporated musique concrète, Indian drone of the tambura, sitar and mellotron, and electronica via several tape loops. To say this is a groundbreaking song is a slight understatement, and the tape loops on here really bring the song into new pop territory, mesmerizing and exciting at the same time. Now, one of the things that they did mention in a press conference that the lyrics from this song were from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I'm sure almost nobody knew what they were talking about, but this just shows you how far they were moving away from that press conference style of mop top fandom that they were leaving behind, like, very quickly.
We all live in a yellow submarine, yellow submarine.
Yellow Submarine is a song I consider to be a bubblegum version of Tomorrow Never Knows with its sound effects, but it's very cheery and bright, unlike its antithesis, Tomorrow Never Knows. The singles from this album really, I guess you could say, are two. The sessions that spawned Paperback Writer and Rain were recorded in conjunction with the other Revolver tracks, but the single that was released off this album is Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby. Now in the States, Yellow Submarine got kind of the nod over Eleanor Rigby, partially due, I guess, to some of the backlash from the Jesus comments. So Eleanor Rigby had some religious references to it, and DJs, I guess, were told, or on their own, they flipped over to the other side to play Yellow Submarine more. So Yellow Submarine consequently got to number 2, and Eleanor Rigby stalled out at number 11. So I think by not going with one from the get-go, that kept one of them from being number 1 in the States. In England, different story. They just pushed Eleanor Rigby, and that hit number 1.
Paperback writer.
The other single that came out not long before this, that was in June 25th to be exact, was Paperback Writer and Rain. And those two songs would have fit great on Revolver if there was room for them. As it turns out, Paperback Writer and Rain were not added to either album that came out during the summer, Yesterday and Today, or Revolver, which is a little bit odd. We'll talk about the US version in a moment. But both Paperback Writer and Rain, I guess Rain could have been performed live on this tour. Paperback Writer was, and that was probably the biggest mistake they did live. Very hard to do those vocals live. They should have had the Beach Boys on stage with them, helping them out with those vocals. They could have maybe pulled it off that way. But they did not do any songs from Revolver on the tour. Now, they could have done a couple songs. Some of these songs would have been capably done in a live setting. Taxman for one, Dr. Robert, She Said, She Said. Yellow Submarine would have been an opportunity to do a sing-along with the crowd, and Got to Get You Into My Life. Now, some of those songs they'd have to do without some of the studio overdubbing, but they could have done it. I mean, would it have mattered? I mean, people can't hear them much anyway. So those they chose not to do that, although Paperback Writer did get in the set list. Now, the US version, as most of you know, omitted 3 tracks from the album, which is probably the worst butcher job that Capitol did to any of the Beatle albums. To remove 3 off of Revolver was even worse than removing songs off of the original Rubber Soul. So he had 11 tracks on the US version of Revolver. And again, they could have added 1 or 2 tracks from the single. They could have brought it up to 12 tracks. Now, for those of you who say, well, they only do 11 tracks on Capitol release, that's not true. They did 12 on Meet the Beatles. They did 12 on Rubber Soul. They could have added one of those to the American version, the US version, but they didn't. So this is one of the reasons why Dave Dexter lost his job originally, because they just didn't know what they were doing. And the new contract that the Beatles signed in January of 1967 gave the Beatles the power to control what the track listings were on all albums going forward. Starting off this video, I talked about the transition of the fans and the music. Well, the artwork was also going through a transition. This cover was a very interesting and unique cover designed specifically for the Beatles by their friend Klaus Voormann. Now, by summer of '66, Carnaby Street was in full swing. It was getting very colorful, but the Beatles decided to go black and white. And Klaus came up with the design. John had called him up and said, hey, have you got any ideas for an album cover? He said, let me put some things together. So 2 of the things he wanted to do was incorporate photographs, because he was still thinking in the pop teen market, but he wanted to incorporate the hair. So here we have a really good combination, I think, of the old like pinup Beatles with a lot of these photos being cut from pinup magazines, and the new Beatles, which is a very highly stylized artistic direction. So when Klaus showed up to the studio with some of the designs, he was a little bit nervous because he had about 4 different designs, and this was his favorite design. Everybody wanted this one, and nobody said anything about the other designs, so he knew that he was glad they picked the best one. This album won a Grammy for Best Album Cover, graphic art, and the back photos taken by Robert Whitaker from the sessions of Revolver. And there were several other titles thought of for this. Revolver was the last one they came out, but here's some of the other titles they were looking at using. Abracadabra was one of them, but that had already been used by somebody. Four Sides to the Circle was John's response to Paul's The Magic Circle. Bubble and Squeak, which I think is horrible. Beatles on Safari, also horrible. Freewheelin' Beatles, also horrible. And Pendulum. Now, Ringo Starr joked about calling it After Geography as kind of a knock on the Stones' Aftermath. But obviously they went with the very catchy Revolver. The sales on this album were almost identical to that of Rubber Soul, and it topped the Billboard charts, hitting #1 on September 10th, a week after Yesterday and Today fell off the #1 spot. So the Beatles were always monopolizing that top spot on the album charts. When I do these album reviews, I always ask myself and you guys, well, what could have been better? What were the flaws in this album? What could they have done differently? Not too many flaws in this album. In fact, I think that this track listing is the best they had ever done up to this point. And part of the reason that was is because George Martin didn't do it. Up to this point, George Martin had done all the track listings and the sequencing. The Beatles got involved with the sequencing on this album. And it just goes to show you how much they were acting together as a band, playing on all the tracks, basically, and working on the title, working on the sequencing. And if you notice, there's alternating between lead vocals on all the tracks. So there's a great diversity in how this album is laid out. So I think that's not a flaw. That's an anti-flaw. That's something that makes all the other albums look flawed by comparison. Now, the one thing that jumps out at me on this album that I wouldn't say is a flaw, but since I look at a wide picture of 60s music and what's going on in the industry and just in music construction overall, one of the things this album is it's built as like an album of singles. That hadn't changed. The longest song on this album is 3 minutes and 2 seconds. So the length is still 2 to 3 minutes, which is basically a singles album, even though the content is much more mature than singles. Now, they had some contemporaries that were starting to stretch out. Already, in England anyway, for quite a while you had the Yardbirds stretching out and doing more improvisation, and eventually Cream. Obviously the Stones and Animals had already been doing that as well. While in the States you had other bands putting stuff down on record that were longer tracks. Let's start with the Stones. On Aftermath, the song Going Home is a long song. That's like 11 minutes. The Paul Butterfield Blues Band had done East West, Country Joe and the Fish, Section 43, and Bob Dylan, Visions of Johanna. So those are songs where the artist is starting to forget about top 40 altogether. But the Beatles, I think, were still in that mode. And that makes this album stay recognized, I think, as a pop album. As I was thinking through some of these other long songs by competing bands, I thought, well, the song that they could have stretched out on this album might have been Tomorrow Never Knows. I mean, that may have been the song that maybe warranted an 8-minute and 22-second production as opposed to Revolution 9. That one would have been better at 3 minutes. So I think they had an opportunity to really do that, but I doubt it ever crossed their mind. It's time to look at some of the contemporary reviews of this album. In Britain, the reception was highly favorable. Melody Maker, having found Rubber Soul almost monotonous at times, lauded the new release, saying it was a work that could change the direction of pop music. The reviewer also highlighted its electronic effects, McCartney's penchant for the classics, and Harrison's stunning use of the sitar. as diverse elements to distinguish the LP as a group effort, such that the 4 band members' individual personalities are now showing through loud and clear. This is a very astute point that they make here at a time when people weren't saying that until like the White Album period. Typically, that's how the story is told. But people were already starting to notice that the Beatles' personalities are coming out here in their songs. Edward Greenfield of The Guardian titled his review Thinking Pop, and wrote that the 3 Beatles songwriters habitually go outside the realm of sloppy love theme and find inspiration instead, as serious artists always do, in specific feelings and specific experiences. Now, Record Mirror, Richard Green, and Peter Jones found the album full of musical ingenuity, yet controversial, and added, there are parts that will split the pop fraternity neatly down the middle. So I think they're also seeing that pop fraternity maybe being the younger girls versus the older guys that are starting to really look at this as an adult music and artistic statements. Now, Ray Davies of the Kinks called the album a load of rubbish. He really laid into this album for some reason. He said some good things about a couple of the songs, but he was relatively negative of his critique. Now, in the U.S., Ralph Gleason in San Francisco Chronicle wrote that it was the most outstanding pop album in years, not a single disappointing track. Writing in the recently launched Crawdaddy, Paul Williams gave the US LP a mixed review in which he admired Love You Too and Eleanor Rigby, but derided Tomorrow Never Knows and Yellow Submarine. And as I said, I don't think the Beatles were actually trying to change their image with their songs. I think they were just playing to their strength and doing what came naturally to them and what excited them. And that's what I think made Revolver great. One of the reasons that Revolver always seemed to be left out of maybe the best albums of all time by the group, I think had a lot to do with what was going on in the summer of 1966. The Beatles had lots of problems they had to deal with. The first one was that Butcher cover album, which I went into in my last album review. There was quite a backlash over the horrifying cover of the Butcher cover. They had shows that they were doing in Manila that went badly. There was backlash then of the Jesus statements by John Lennon. Those had come out earlier in the year, but nobody took note of it until one magazine really kind of pushed it and tried to make it very tabloidy, which worked. That happened just before the release of Revolver. Revolver hit #1 on the charts in the next days when John Lennon made his apology, which was right at the beginning of their tour. So all that, Epstein even came to the States early to try to placate things, and the tour was almost canceled over all this stuff. So this is all happening when Revolver comes out. They went right back home after the tour and took another 3 months off. So you had 3 months off at the beginning of the year, 3 months off at the end of the year, and they were just trying to decompress and deal with all the trauma from the touring. And when they got home, they were voted the #2 band in England after the Beach Boys. So the song Good Vibrations had come out, taken the world by storm, probably the greatest single to date. And so the Beatles were being seen as falling behind. Then they disappear for 3 months, and that's where the breakup talk started. And for this time, when the Beach Boys were ranked higher in their own home country, I mean, the Beach Boys were ahead of the Beatles technologically. I mean, if you think of Good Vibrations versus Tomorrow Never Knows, they were both extremely progressive, but one was a #1 song and one was an album track. Tomorrow Never Knows, if you never bought the album, typically you're not going to hear it because it wasn't played on the radio. As you all know, there was not a more competitive band on the planet than the Beatles, so they weren't going to take any of this competition lying down. So after their rest, they went back into the studio in December to get back to work. Thank you for watching. I'll be continuing my Beatle album reviews in coming videos, but in the meantime, feel free to support the channel in a bigger way if you'd like to. I've got a tip jar below. I've got a Patreon subscription, and I've got a website where you can buy some merchandise, which also helps support this channel. I thank you in advance for clicking the subscribe button, and I'll be back soon here on Pop Goes the 60s.